Hey everybody, it's James from dreamweavertutorial.co.uk, and I get so many requests from people asking me, James, when are you going to make a contact form tutorial? In fact, it's one of my most heavily requested tutorials that I get. And I know it's so difficult to find a really decent contact form that not only looks good, looks professional and contemporary, but is also safe and secure. A contact form that protects your website from the threat of email injection and also validates the form automatically to save you a ton of admin work cleaning out your email inbox from half-filled messages. You're also looking for a contact form that can be easily adapted to fit any website. So we're going to make a big, bold form with big form input areas, a large text area and generously sized submit button. But that's not all. We'll also be attaching an amazing form validation system. We'll style a thank you message that will appear after the form has been submitted, and we'll learn how to write a simple inline JavaScript redirect to send people to a page of your choice after the form has been submitted. So this contact form tutorial is split into two parts. The first part, we will discover how to build and style a modern and contemporary contact form. In part 2, we will download and attach a MooTools validation engine to give our form an instant client-side validation. We'll also attach a very safe and secure PHP backup validation to our form, which will kick into action if someone has their JavaScript in their browsers turned off. It will also help to circumvent spam bots who try to bypass the JavaScript validation. It will also help to keep your email inbox as clean as possible. And finally, we'll add CSS-free rounded corners, and we'll use pseudo selectors to add a focus to the form when a form input is clicked inside of. Now, it all sounds very difficult, but I promise you I'll make it very easy for you to complete. In fact, as long as you have the ability to type, and particularly the ability to type what you see on the screen in front of you, then you will have no problems completing this tutorial. Now, you can make the form smaller or bigger if you like. Wherever there is a width property, you can shrink the form to fit in a more compact space. The form is also backwards compatible and will work in Internet Explorer 8, 7 and 6, the browser that we all love to hate. Now, I'll be using Dreamweaver CS5 to build the contact form, but regular subscribers to my channel and Dreamweaver tutorial website already know that I make my tutorials compatible for Dreamweaver CS3 and CS4 users also. If you want to take a look at the form and try it out before you start the tutorial, then you can click on a link in the description box, and you are more than welcome to fill out the form and submit it as many times as you like. Okay, now it's very important that you do everything that I do. Do not try to deviate from the instructions I give you until after you've completed both parts of this tutorial. Okay, so without further ado, I'll give you part 1 of this contact form tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to create a new folder so that I can define a new site, and I suggest you do the same. We can get the form built away from the clutter of our own websites and then copy over the files. So do exactly what I do and it will all work out just fine. So I've created a folder called Contact Form Site. Inside that folder, I'm going to create two folders, one called Images and the other called CSS. We're not using any images in this tutorial, but we're making an images folder in case you want to add images in the future, and also because CS4 users will need to define an images folder when creating a new site. So I'll just pop that folder into my sites folder, but if you want to leave it on your desktop for now, that's fine too, as long as you know where it is when we come to define a new site. So over into Dreamweaver now, and I'm going to define a new site to which I will name Contact Form Site. CS4 users, you will also need to define your images folder, but CS5 users, you can just define the location of the folder we just created. So I'll do that now, and I'll search for Contact Form Site folder and double click on it, and then I'll press select to create my site, and then I will save the site, and it will then be recreated inside of the files panel inside of Dreamweaver. Okay, so here is the folder structure in the files panel. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll do that by right clicking inside of the files panel. I'll then click to create a new folder, and I'll name that folder simply Contact. Okay, so once you've created that folder, we're going to place the CSS and image folders into the contact folder from within inside Dreamweaver. And it's this contact folder and all of the content that we add to it which is going to sit inside of your real website along with the site root or main spine of your website. Now I'm going to create a new file, and as this is a PHP contact form we are creating, I would normally go and select a new PHP document. But as we'll be working on this file without using a testing server for now, we're going to create a HTML file and we will turn it into a PHP file later. So I'm going to save it for now as contact.html. And you'll see the file appear in the files panel on the right. Okay, so in code view, as usual, I'm going to go straight in between the body tags and I'm going to create an enclosing wrapper div for the form. So I'll create a div with an ID of form wrap. Now I'm going to close off the form wrap div with a closing comment, and guys, you really should get into the habit of putting closing comments because it makes it so much easier to find the code you were looking for. Okay, so now inside of the form wrap div, I'm going to start creating the form and the elements that make up the form. So I'll create a div with an ID of form, and again I'll put a closing comment to close off that div tag, and we'll go inside of the form div. Okay, now each time we create a form element, we will create it inside of a row. Not a table row, we're going to create our own rows using CSS. So I'm going to create a div with a class of row. And inside this div, it can be used again as we were assigning it as a class. So it's a div with a class. And I'm going to again close this off with a closing comment, so end row. And we'll go inside of the row class div, and every row that we create is going to have a label to identify that particular form element. So I'm going to create a class of label and close the label class off. The first label will be to establish the name of the person contacting you in the contact form. So we will ask for the name of the individual or company. So we'll type your name. So for them to give a reply, we will need to provide them with an input area for them to type their name. So I'll create a div with a class of input, and this is just a wrapper div for the input area we are going to create for the web visitor to type their name into. Form elements will show up in orange if using the default Dreamweaver settings. So I'm going to type input type equals, and the type will be a text input. We'll give it an ID of full name. We'll give it a class of detail, and we will give it a name of full name also. We're also going to create a value field, but we're going to leave it blank as in part 2 of this tutorial we'll be passing in some PHP commands into that space. And lastly, to finish off, we'll close the input with a closing angle bracket. Next to the name input area, we're going to place a snippet of text that will help and guide the user along the process of completing the form. So we'll create a div with a class of context, and we'll make it a div with a class so we can reuse it on the next input area we create. So I'll place the closing comment, and inside of the div you can type anything you want. I'm going to type e.g. John Smith or Jane Doe, just to fill the area with some text to gaze upon in the browser preview. So we can reuse all of this code for our next input field. So I'll highlight all of the code and press Ctrl C to copy it, and then I'll paste it below, making sure you're still inside of the form div. Then we can simply type over the your name label and rename it for our next field, which is the email field. And we can change the input ID to email. We will keep the same class of detail, but we'll change the input name and rename that to email too. Again, we will keep the value field present but unaltered for now. So I'll delete the contents of the context div and type another clue for the user of the form, which will be a short note to reassure the user that we will not pass on the email address to anyone. Okay, so in design view we can see that we have already created 2 input fields relatively easily. Right, let's copy the previous HTML fields and paste them below, and we can overtype some of the code to create our text area for the user to write a message back to us. So the first thing we can do is to change the label text. So I'm going to delete the current text and I'm going to type simply your message. For the message area, we do not need to use a form input. Instead, we will remove that line of code and create a new line of code for a text area. So I'll type text area ID equals comment, like that, and I'll give it a name of comment, and we'll give it a class of mess, M-E-S-S, which is obviously short for message. And I'll close off the text area, but note that we cannot use the value field for the text area like we did for the form inputs above. And for the text area, we will not use the context div as a hint for the user, as the your message text will suffice here. So delete that line of code and smarten up your HTML. Okay, so we'll preview that in a browser. I'm going to preview in Chrome, and here we can see the bare bones of the form structure with no apparent styling. And yeah, we're going to change the way it looks drastically to create a big bold form. And we'll also make this text area a lot bigger by stretching it out using CSS, and we need to add a submit button to the bottom of the form to allow our customers or users to send us a message. So let's switch back to Dreamweaver now, and let's add our submit button just after the text area. So create a space and we'll type div class equals, and we'll give it a class of submit, and we'll place our submit button inside of this div tag. And to create a submit button we need to type input, and the input type will be submit with an ID of submit. So I've typed input type equals submit, we'll give it an ID equal to submit, and we'll name it as submit and we'll also give it a value of send message, and that whatever you type into the value area for the submit button is what's going to appear on the text of the button itself. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the button in a browser, and here it is. We'll make the button a little bit larger and more inviting, and we'll get to work styling the whole form up, and we'll do that by creating all of our CSS selectors to target the various form elements. So let's do that now. We'll click anywhere inside of the enclosing form wrap div, and we'll go over to the CSS styles panel and click on the create new CSS rule button and define a new style sheet file, and then click OK. And we can call the style sheet file contactform.css. Now let's go into the contact folder and save the CSS style sheet in the CSS folder that we created at the start of the tutorial. So click OK, and notice in the CSS styles panel we have the CSS selector that we just created. Now click inside of the div with an ID of form, then create a new CSS rule, and we'll click OK and then OK again. And we'll create a selector for the row class too. So click inside of the div, create a new CSS rule. We'll make it slightly less specific and click OK and OK again. We'll also create a rule for the label class, and again we'll go slightly less specific with this one. And let's also create a rule for the input class, and that's the input class div rather than the actual input itself. We'll go less specific for that too. And then when you're ready, press OK and OK again. Okay, there are a few more selectors to create, so let's click on the context div to create a selector for that. And again, we'll go slightly less specific because we don't want really long selectors. And if we now go further down the page, and we can find the div enclosing our submit button, and we'll create a selector from that. So just there, the div with a class of submit, we'll create the rule and go slightly less specific, and then click OK. Alright, so let's take a look at our style sheet for a moment, and we can see all of the empty selectors sitting there waiting for us to fill them up with our styles. So I'll spread them out a little bit so that we can see what we are going to be working with. Now to make it easier to code and see the form, I'm going to change the layout of Dreamweaver so that I can run the CSS styles parallel to the form. So I'm going to go up to the layout icon, and I'm going to select to split vertically from the drop down menu. I'll collapse the sidebar to icons view and minimize the icons as much as possible, and I'll click and drag on the dividing bar and drag out the form to be closer to the CSS styles. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is to create a body selector so that we can paint the background in a light grey colour, which will show a contrast between the form and the background. So I'll type body and open and close curly braces, and then I'll set the background colour to £E9 E9 E9, and that will just shade the background just a touch. And we can see in design view that the form input areas are now showing up clearer thanks to the darker background. Okay, so let's target the form wrap div, which is the wrapper for our form, and we'll add a width property and set the width to 720 pixels. We'll set a top margin of 30 pixels and a margin left of 30 pixels because I want to bring the form away from the edges of the web page so we can see what we are doing. Alright, so we'll set the background colour of the form to be £FFF, and that's pure white, and notice the changes that occur in design view. Now we'll set a border for the form to go all the way around of the form at 1 pixel solid £F1 F1 F1, which is a very subtle grey colour. Okay, so we'll add Mozilla border radius to the form wrapper and get some rounded corners, and we'll go 20 pixels all the way around, so that's -moz border radius 20 pixels, and we'll set a box shadow too, and that's -moz box shadow 2 pixels 2 pixels 5 pixel radius, and that's £999, which is grey. And now we'll do the same for the Chrome browser, but we'll copy the styles and overtype the Moz part with the WebKit extension to get those properties to show up in Chrome. So I'll just overtype WebKit for the border radius and WebKit for the box shadow. Excellent. And I'll set some padding, and that will be 16 pixels on the top, 10 pixels left and right, and 40 pixels on the bottom. And I think we'll preview that in the browser to check it out now. So I'll preview in Chrome and save the changes. And we can see that the form wrap div has now been styled with the CSS3 rounded corners, and the box shadow and the padding is also just how I set it to. So we'll start styling the inner contents of the form and the input areas to make them longer and wider. So we'll go back into Dreamweaver now, and we'll start to style the div with the ID of form, and we'll set a border on the top of the form, and remember that the form wrap is pushing the form contents down by 16 pixels. We'll set border top : 1 pixel solid £EEE and a semicolon on the end, and we'll set a width of the form div and constrain it to 720 pixels. Now remember that we put each form input inside of a div with a class of row, and that is what we are going to style right now. And the first thing we will do is to set a border on the bottom, so we'll type border bottom : 1 pixel solid £EEE and a semicolon on the end. The border will help to define the rows as individual areas. Now we'll set each row to display block, and we'll specify a line height of about 38 pixels. Now we'll set the overflow to auto and a padding on the top and bottom of 24 pixels and 0 pixels on the left and onto the right. We'll also set a width of 100%. Now we set the display to block and the various line height and padding properties so that when we float the label and input areas below, they won't try to invade the input areas above them. Okay, so now we'll style the labels of each form input, so that will be your name, your email address and your message, and these will be placed inside of a div with a class of label. So we'll set a font size of 16 pixels. We'll set a font weight of bold and press refresh to see the changes in design view. We'll set the font family to Arial, and we'll set a width for the label to be around 180 pixels, and then we'll press refresh. Brilliant. Okay, we will now set the alignment of the text, and we'll set that to align to the right and press F5 or to see the change. We'll also float the label to the left, and we will also do that for all of the divs inside of each row. Okay, so now let's take a look at our progress in design view, and it all looks a bit messy right now, but that's because we need to float the input areas and the form guidance text to the left also to meet up with the labels that we've only just now floated themselves. Just to finish off, we'll add some padding to the labels, 10 pixels to the right. We'll also add a margin on the right, and again 10 pixels for that, and see the changes inside of design view. Okay, so we're doing really well now and almost have this form styled up. So let's preview in a browser then. So I'll preview that inside of Chrome, and we can see that the form is starting to take shape. We're going to make the form input areas much bigger. And we're also going to float the guidance text to the left, which I just mentioned earlier, and that will meet up with the rest of the form elements. We also need to move the submit button over a little bit to the right and make the message area wider and longer too. Okay, so let's head back into Dreamweaver now and we can start to style the input areas. The first thing we'll do is to float the input divs to the left and press refresh to see the changes in design view. We'll also add a margin right of 10 pixels, so it's margin dash right colon 10 pixels semicolon, and then we'll set the width to auto. Okay, so we'll style the guidance text inside of the context div and we'll lower the tone of the colour to a light grey. So that's colour colon pound 999 and a semicolon. You'll see the colour change inside of design view. We'll also change the size of the font to be 11 pixels and we'll set the font style to italic. Now we'll need to make the context div fit well into the space we've assigned for it, and we'll start by setting the line height. And we'll set the line height to 14 pixels. And we'll also change the font family to Arial. And we'll set a width of 200 pixels. And you'll see if you press refresh that the text is just underneath the label div in design view. And finally we'll float the div to the left to align with the rest of the divs in the row. So let's see what we've accomplished so far, and this form is really starting to take shape now and we've nearly finished. Let's make the input areas bigger and bolder and we'll enlarge that message area and align the submit button now. Now to change the size of the input areas we'll need to directly target the form inputs. Up until now we've been targeting the divs surrounding the form inputs. So if I switch to the HTML source and now go and find the input areas and for instance go to the email input area, here is the form input. It has an ID of email, a class of detail. The full name input also has a class of detail, so we can target the size of those inputs together. The text area we gave a class of mess, so we can target the width and height of that separately. So we will now need to create a selector called detail and a selector called mess, and we can adjust the sizes of the form inputs. So I'll type .detail to target the class of detail, open and close curly braces, and I'll set a width of 260 pixels, and you'll see the change in design view. And if your form input is overlapping the context div, then don't worry because the changes to the font family, size and padding of the form input will bring it into line. So let's change the font family to Arial. And you'll notice that we've used Arial all the way through this tutorial. We'll also change the font size of the text typed into the form input, so we'll make that 20 pixels. We'll add a little bit of padding to make the text fit well inside of the input area, so 7 pixels top and bottom and 8 pixels left and right. Okay, we'll also set the margin to 0 and then we'll take a look inside of design view. So here are the big name and email address input areas, all perfectly positioned, and we'll check the input text in the browser in just a moment. We now need to style the message text area so that it has a good height and width and is in keeping with the general styles of the contact form. Okay, so we'll start by creating our selector called mess, which we assign to the message text area tag. So that's .mess, open and close curly braces, and we'll assign a width property of 450 pixels. We'll also assign a height property to the message area of 280 pixels and then press refresh. Now in design view we can see that our big message area very much in keeping with a standard form. Now we'll take a quick look at this form in a browser because I want to show you a very common issue that can occur when setting the width of a form. Okay, so I'll preview in Chrome and save the changes. Okay, so here is the form as it appears in Chrome, and on the bottom right hand corner there is a small resize handle to which you can click and drag the form to expand it. This can cause a text area to do some strange things in a browser, and in this case is misaligned and forces the text above it. An annoying scroll bar also appears here, which I just don't want either. I'd like the visitor to be able to expand the form vertically, but I want to restrain someone from breaking the form like I am here. So I'm going to set a maximum width by typing max-width and restrict the form to 450 pixels as I originally intended it to be. So now when we preview the form in Chrome, I can still grab the resize handle, but I won't be able to expand the text area horizontally. I can still expand vertically, but horizontally it's been restricted by setting the max width property. Okay, so let's head back into Dreamweaver now, and I want to show you another property that will take care of an issue that can show up in Explorer sometimes, and that property is the overflow property. I'm going to set the overflow to auto, and I'll just quickly comment out the line so I can show you what issue it takes care of in Explorer. Okay, so if I now preview the form inside of Internet Explorer 8, we can see a rather annoying scroll bar is set on the right hand side of the text area, and by setting the overflow to auto, it should have the effect of removing the scroll bar from appearing altogether. So if I now reinstate the overflow property and preview again in Internet Explorer 8, we can see that the form looks the same on either side. Okay, so let's head back into Dreamweaver and we'll find our .mesh selector for the text area, and we'll set a font family, and we'll set the font family to Arial. We'll also set the font size to 20 pixels. We'll set padding of 7 pixels on the top and bottom and 8 pixels on the left and right to bring the message typed into the text area away from the edges. We'll set a line height of 1em, which is equivalent of 16 pixels, and finally a margin of 0. Okay, so let's now preview in a browser and test our input areas out for size. So I'll place my cursor inside of the first input and type my name. And you can see that the text is padded in very well. The same padding was applied to the email field with the same selector. We can also see that the text in the message area is also padded out uniformly. So I'm quite happy we have the right amount of padding for the form. Okay, that leaves us just the submit button to style. Let's move the submit button over and make it a little bit larger. So switching back into Dreamweaver, and if you go to the bottom of the style sheet, you will see the last remaining selector, which is for the submit button. We'll set the font family of that selector to Arial, and actually we should change the selector to target the submit button, which is an ID of submit, rather than target the div enclosing the submit button. So we'll change it to #submit instead of .submit. And now in this selector we can change the size of the actual button and the text which sits inside of it. So we'll set a margin on the top of the button of 25 pixels, and that will push it down slightly. We'll move the button over in line with the form fields, and we'll set a margin left of around 210 pixels, and we'll set a colour of the text, so that's colour $:000, and change the font size to 16 pixels. Fantastic. We'll also set a text shadow, and we'll make it 1 pixel, 1 pixel, 1 pixel, £999, and a semicolon on the end, and we'll set a padding all around of 10 pixels to make the button stand out a little bit better. And here we see it in design view, but we went a little too far with our margin on the button, so we'll change it to 200 pixels, and that's better. So let's preview in a browser. I'll preview in Chrome and save the changes, and the form is looking great. Give yourself a pat on the back for getting this far. We have a nice big form button which is aligned to our big bold form inputs. We have our guidance text to help the user to fill in the form. Now the form styling is not completely finished, but we now have enough of the form styled that we are able to move on to the second stage of this form build. So if you're watching from YouTube or some other website hosting this video, there will be a link for you to click in the description box, and it will take you to this web page where you'll be able to download the PHP and JavaScript form validation processing scripts you will need to complete part 2 of this tutorial. When you click on the link, you'll arrive at this destination page, and you'll need to click on the download files button just below the video. If you are using Firefox or a Gecko based browser, then you will need to right click and save the link to your desktop in order for the download to begin. If you're using Safari, then you may need to option and click and save the link to your desktop. The files are contained in a zip file, and you'll need to simply extract the folder called form validation to your desktop. So please join me in part 2 of this tutorial, which will be to attach a MooTools validation engine to give our form an instant client-side validation. And we'll also attach a very safe and secure PHP backup validation to our form, which will kick into action if someone has their JavaScript in their browsers turned off. And we'll also style a thank you message upon completion of the form, And finally, to initiate a redirect to a web page of your choice once the form has been submitted. Okay, I'll see you in a moment.